The bank manager set down the folder, folded his hands, and looked across the desk at my son-in-law with an expression I recognized immediately. It was the look professionals use when they're about to deliver news that can't be softened. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "The account holder listed here has not authorized this transaction." My daughter looked at him sideways. "What do you mean not authorized? We've been managing that business for 3 years. The manager cleared his throat. "The sole authorized signatory on this account is a Mr. Lawrence Gibbs." He paused. "Is he available?" My son-in-law's face went still in a way I hadn't seen before. Then the manager's assistant opened the side door to the conference room, and I walked in. My daughter's hand went to her mouth. My son-in-law simply stared, the way a person stares when the floor disappears beneath them without warning. Neither of them said a word for a long moment, but to understand how we arrived at that conference room, you need to know what happened the Thanksgiving before. My name is Lawrence Gibbs. Most people call me Larry. I'm 68 years old, retired now, and I live outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, in a house I built with my own hands over the better part of 2 summers when I was 41. My wife Beverly used to say I never trusted anything I hadn't made myself. She wasn't wrong. I spent 32 years running a small commercial printing business in East Tennessee. Nothing flashy. We printed menus, promotional materials, corporate letterhead, the kind of work that doesn't get talked about at dinner parties, but keeps the lights on for 1,000 different businesses across the region. It was honest work. I was proud of it. Beverly passed 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. Anyone who has watched someone they love disappear that slowly understands that grief doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates. It settles into the spaces where ordinary life used to be. After she was gone, I did what a lot of men my age do. I kept moving. I kept working. I told myself staying busy was the same as staying okay. Our daughter Nadine was 36 when her mother died. She and her husband Scott had been married about 5 years at that point. They lived about 20 minutes from me, over in Maryville. Scott ran a small home renovation outfit. Nadine worked part-time at a dental office and handled most of the bookkeeping for Scott's business. We were close after Beverly passed. For about a year, genuinely close. Nadine came over for Sunday dinners. She called during the week just to check in. When the grief felt heaviest, she seemed to understand without needing it explained. I was grateful for that. I told her so. Then Scott's renovation business hit trouble. A bad winter, 2 clients who didn't pay. A supplier dispute that turned into a lawsuit. By the spring following Beverly's death, they were struggling seriously. I remember the evening Nadine sat across from me in my kitchen, looking like she hadn't slept in a week. "Dad," she said, "I don't know how much longer we can keep this going." Scott sat beside her, elbows on the table, staring at his coffee. I'd always had a complicated relationship with Scott. He was a capable man in many ways, but he had a habit of believing things were simpler than they were. He had a tendency to push forward without fully understanding what he was pushing into. Still, these were my daughter and my son-in-law, and they were in real trouble. What they didn't know, and what I hadn't mentioned to anyone at that point, was that I had already been considering a transition for the printing business. Beverly and I had talked about it for years. When the time came, I had always planned to offer Nadine the opportunity to take over operations. Not as a gift, not as charity, but as a real arrangement. She was organized, she understood bookkeeping, and she had grown up watching how the business operated. So I made them an offer. I told them I would bring them into the printing business. Nadine would manage the administrative side. Scott would oversee client relationships and operations. I would stay on as an advisor, stepping back gradually. In exchange, they would draw a salary, and eventually, once the business had stabilized under their management, we would discuss a formal ownership transition. I was careful with my wording. I said eventually. I said discuss. I said once stabilized. I did not say the business was already theirs. That distinction, it turned out, mattered more than I understood at the time. The first year went reasonably well. Nadine took to the administrative work naturally. Scott brought in 2 new accounts. I was still coming in 3 days a week, still handling the financials, still signing off on anything significant. The business was structured through an LLC I had established years earlier on the advice of my accountant, primarily for liability and estate planning purposes. The LLC was registered in my name alone. The business bank account was under my authorization alone. I never hid this from them. I simply never announced it either. At the time, it didn't feel relevant. Family was family. The details would get sorted out when the time was right. Looking back, I should have put everything in writing from the beginning. I should have sat down with an attorney, with both of them present, and made every expectation explicit. I didn't. Partly because I was still grieving. Partly because formalizing it felt cold, and I didn't want anything between us to feel cold. And partly, if I'm honest with myself, because I still wasn't sure. I wasn't sure Scott was ready for the responsibility he seemed to assume was already his. The second year, things began to shift. Small things at first, the kind that are easy to explain away individually. Scott started making purchasing decisions without consulting me. New equipment I hadn't approved. A client contract signed without my review. When I mentioned it, he apologized easily, the way a person apologizes when they don't believe they've actually done anything wrong. Nadine stopped asking my opinion on operational matters. She still called, but the calls became shorter, more functional. When I raised a concern about a pricing structure she and Scott had changed, she listened politely and then said, "Dad, we've got it handled." As if my decades in the industry were a memory she was grateful for, but no longer needed. I told myself it was healthy. They were finding their footing. That was the goal, wasn't it? Then came small comments, similar to the kind Beverly would have identified immediately as warning signs. One evening I stopped by the office to pick up some files and overheard Scott on the phone with someone I didn't recognize, talking about our business and our client base, and where we're taking this operation. Confident. Proprietary. Not a trace of uncertainty. I stood in the hallway outside his office for a moment. Then I went and got my files and drove home. Something I had been not quite feeling for months came a little closer to the surface that evening. The incident I keep returning to, the one that made things impossible to ignore, happened on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-October. I had come in to review the quarterly financials. Nadine was at the front desk. She looked up when I walked in, and something crossed her face. Not happiness. Not exactly irritation, either. Something in between. "Dad, I didn't know you were coming in today." "I come in Tuesdays," I said. "Right." She went back to her screen. "Scott's in a meeting. I'll let him know you're here." I went to my office, which by then had started feeling slightly less like my office, and pulled up the quarterly reports. 15 minutes later, Scott appeared in the doorway. Larry. He still called me Larry. Never Dad, which I had never pushed for, but the formality had always carried a certain message. "Sit down," I said. He did. I spent about 20 minutes going through the numbers with him. Revenue was up slightly. Expenses were up more. There was a line item I didn't recognize under development costs that turned out to be an exploratory conversation Scott had initiated with a commercial real estate agent about moving the operation to a larger facility. I set the paper down. "You were looking at new locations?" "Just exploring options," without talking to me. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as patient. The way you might look at someone who keeps asking questions they should already know the answers to. "Larry, if we're going to grow this business, I haven't decided we're growing this business." The room got very quiet. Scott leaned back slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this is still my business, Scott. No decisions about expansion happen without my involvement." For a moment, I watched him recalibrate. I could see it happening, the careful adjustment, the retrieval of the appropriate response. "Of course," he said, finally. "I understand that." But his eyes said something different entirely. I drove home that evening, thinking about a conversation I'd had with Beverly years earlier. One of those late-night talks you have when the house is quiet, and the kids are grown, and you finally have enough distance to say what you actually think. She had said, "The thing about Scott is, he's not unkind. He's just convinced that what he wants is also what's fair." I had laughed at the time. She was right, as usual. I hadn't laughed enough at the right moments when she was saying true things. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, I had started doing what I should have done from the beginning. I called my attorney, a woman named Frances who had handled the business's legal matters for almost a decade. She reviewed the LLC structure and confirmed what I already knew. The business was mine. My name, my authorization, my decision. Nothing Nadine or Scott had done in the previous 2 years had altered that in any legal sense. I told Frances what I was observing. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Larry, you need to have an explicit conversation with them about ownership status. I know. Sooner rather than later. I know." She paused. "What's stopping you?" And there it was. The question that had been sitting in the back of my mind for months. What was stopping me? I drove home from her office, feeling the weight of it. The truth was that I kept hoping my daughter would come to me. Not Scott. Nadine. I kept waiting for the moment she would sit down and say, "Dad, what are we doing here? What is the actual plan?" I kept hoping she would show me that she still understood who I was in this arrangement, that she still saw me as something more than a convenient predecessor, whose name happened to still be on some paperwork. That moment never came. Thanksgiving was at their house that year. About 16 people. A mix of Nadine and Scott's friends, Scott's parents, a few neighbors. I arrived with a bottle of wine and a pecan pie Beverly's mother used to make every year. A recipe I had learned to make myself in the years, since Beverly was gone. Dinner was pleasant enough on the surface. The food was good. The conversation moved around the table, without landing anywhere uncomfortable. I sat next to Scott's father, a decent man from Georgia, who liked to talk about college football, and treated everyone around him with old-fashioned courtesy. We got along fine. Then, after dinner, while people were gathering in the living room with their coffee and dessert, I heard Scott across the room telling a story to a group of his friends. I caught pieces of it at first, then more. He was talking about the business. He was describing plans for expansion. A new location, new equipment, a different client demographic, larger accounts, regional reach. He spoke with the ease and certainty of a man describing his own life. I listened for 2 or 3 minutes. Nobody in that circle knew anything was unusual. To them, it was simply a man talking about his work. Then Scott said, "Once we complete the ownership transfer, we'll really be able to move." Ownership transfer. I set my coffee cup down carefully on the side table. I looked around the room. Nadine was in the kitchen, laughing about something with one of her friends. The grandchildren were running down the hallway. Everything looked exactly like a normal family Thanksgiving. Inside, something I had been postponing for months finally settled into certainty. No ownership transfer had been discussed. No ownership transfer had been agreed upon. No paperwork had been drawn up. No terms negotiated. Nothing. And yet Scott was telling people it was already decided. I drove home that night alone. The hills east of Knoxville were dark and quiet. I had the radio off. I thought about Beverly, which I do most often when I'm driving at night and the road is empty. I thought about what she would say. She would have been direct. She always was. She would have said, "Lawrence, you built that business. You don't owe an apology for protecting it." I called Frances the following morning. "I need to know what would happen," I told her, "if someone tried to initiate a transaction with the business bank account without my authorization." "Nothing," she said simply. "Not without your signature. The account structure doesn't allow it. And if they tried to initiate a loan against the business assets? Same answer. The LLC requires your signature on any debt obligation." I exhaled slowly. "Larry," Frances said, "what's happening?" I told her about Thanksgiving. I told her what Scott had said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you want me to send a formal letter clarifying ownership status?" "Not yet. What are you waiting for?" I thought about that question for a long moment. The same question again. "I want to give my daughter one more chance," I said, "to show me she understands what's happening." Frances didn't argue. She was wise enough to know that legal clarity and family clarity are 2 different problems. The weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas were the strangest of my life since Beverly died. I continued going into the office. I continued performing the normal routines. But something had fundamentally changed in how I saw things. I noticed details I had been filtering out before. The way Scott introduced me to new clients. Larry helps us out from time to time, as though I were a consultant they'd brought in, not the man whose signature was on the building lease. The way Nadine would answer calls at the front desk with, Gibbs Printing, this is Nadine. No longer, this is Mr. Gibbs's office. As though my name were simply the name of the building, and not of the man still running it. I noticed that my suggestions in operational meetings were being received with polite acknowledgement, and then quietly not followed. I noticed that certain documents had started going to Scott's email rather than mine. Small administrative redirections that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. One afternoon in early December, I came in to find that my nameplate had been moved from the primary office door to a smaller door at the back of the suite. Nobody mentioned it. When I stood and looked at that door for a moment, one of the younger employees, who had been hired that year, walked past and said, cheerfully, "Oh, we reorganized the offices last week. Hope that's okay." Hope that's okay. I was standing in front of a door with my own name on it, in a building I leased, in a business I had built over 3 decades, and a 26-year-old was asking me if it was okay. I went home early that day. I sat in Beverly's chair, the one she always used when she read in the evenings, and I looked at the framed photograph on the bookshelf. The one from our 30th anniversary. The two of us standing outside the original print shop location on the day we paid off the building note. We both looked so young in that photo. We looked like people who believed everything was still ahead of them. I sat there for a long time. That evening, Nadine called. We talked for a few minutes about Christmas plans, about her son and daughter's school schedules, ordinary things. Then I said, "Nadine, I need you to tell me something honestly." She went a little quiet. "Okay, does Scott believe he owns the business?" The pause was brief, but it told me everything before she answered. "Dad, we've been running it for 2 years. That's not what I asked." Another pause. "He feels like the transition is essentially complete." I looked out the window at the dark backyard. The lights from the neighbor's house reflected off the frost on the lawn. "Has any document been signed?" "You said we'd discuss it when the time was right. Has any document been signed, Nadine?" Her voice shifted. Something tightened in it. "Dad, we've invested everything in this business. Our savings. Our time. 3 years of our lives. I know you have. Scott is trying to grow something here. He has a vision for it. We have a right." She stopped herself, but not quite in time. I waited. "We care about this business," she said more carefully. I said, "I know you do." And I meant it. That was the part that hurt most, in fact. That she did care. That it wasn't entirely cynical. It was something more complicated and more painful than cynicism. It was entitlement growing quietly inside genuine investment, until she could no longer clearly see the difference between what she had contributed and what she had been given. "Nadine," I said gently, "I need you to understand something. Nothing has been decided. Nothing has been transferred. The business is still mine, and I need Scott to understand that too." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "This isn't fair, Dad." I said nothing. "You let us believe. I let you hope," I said. "There's a difference." She hung up before I did, not angrily, but firmly, with the kind of click that means a conversation is over. I sat with the phone in my hand for a minute. Then I called Frances and told her to prepare whatever documentation she thought was appropriate. Christmas came the way it always does, whether you want it to or not. I spent Christmas morning with my son from my first marriage, a quiet man named Douglas who lives in Chattanooga and has about as much appetite for drama as a stone fence. We had breakfast, exchanged modest gifts, talked about his kids. It was peaceful. It was exactly the kind of Christmas I had needed without knowing it. In the early afternoon, Nadine called. Her voice was formal in a way it had never been with me before. "We need to go over some things related to the business," she said. "All right. Can you come by the office tomorrow? There are documents Scott wants you to look at." Documents. I thought about that word for a moment. What kind of documents? Just some operational things. It won't take long. I told her I'd be there. I called Frances that evening. "They want to meet tomorrow at the office," I said. "I'll come with you," she said immediately. I told them it would just be me. Larry, I want to see exactly what they're doing before we show them anything. She agreed, reluctantly, but she told me to call her immediately after, whatever happened. I arrived at the office the following morning at 9. Nadine met me at the door. She looked like she hadn't slept. Scott was already at the conference table, a stack of folders in front of him, doing a poor impression of casual. "Morning, Larry." He gestured to a chair. "Thanks for coming in." I sat down. He opened the first folder and slid several pages across the table. "We've put together a transition proposal," he said. "Transfer of LLC ownership, effective immediately upon your signature." I looked at the papers without touching them. "We've also drafted a consulting agreement," Nadine added, sitting across from me. "You'd stay connected, of course. You'd have a monthly retainer." "A retainer. For my own business. We've had it reviewed by an attorney," Scott continued. "Everything is structured fairly. 30% of profit distributions for the first 5 years, then a declining arrangement after that." I looked up from the papers. "Who reviewed this?" "A business attorney, Scott, found in Nashville," Nadine said. "Did you tell him the business wasn't already yours?" Silence. Scott's jaw tightened slightly. "We've been operating this business. I know what you've been doing," I said. "Not unkindly. Quietly. I've been watching every bit of it." I pushed the papers back across the table. Scott looked at them, then at me. "Larry, this is fair. My attorney reviewed the ownership structure last month," I said. "Nothing has changed. Nothing was ever legally transferred. The business is mine, the accounts are mine, and no transaction you've initiated or planned can proceed without my authorization." Nadine looked like she had been struck. "Dad, I'm not angry," I said. And I wasn't. I was something sadder than angry. But I need you both to understand something clearly. For the last 2 years, you have been employees, not owners. I invited you into this business because I loved you, and because I wanted to give you an opportunity. At some point, somewhere along the way, you both convinced yourselves that the opportunity had already become the outcome. Scott's face had gone very still. "It hasn't," I said. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Outside the conference room window, the December sky was flat and gray. Then Scott said, "So what happens now?" "That depends on you," I said. "Both of you." I stood and picked up my coat. "I'm not walking out of your lives," I told Nadine. "I'm your father. I will be your father until I die, and that isn't going to change." I looked at her directly. "But the arrangement as it existed is over. I need time to think about what, if anything, comes next." Scott started to speak. I held up a hand, not harshly, just clearly. "I'll be in touch through Francis," I said. I walked out. The cold hit me the same way it had hit me after Beverly's last hospital stay. That same particular January air that makes everything feel stripped and plain and true. I sat in my truck for a few minutes without starting the engine. Then I called Francis. "How'd it go?" she asked. "About how I expected." She exhaled. "What do you need?" "Let's talk about formal ownership documentation," I said. "Let's make sure everything is clear and properly recorded." "Already started," she said. I started the truck and pulled out of the parking lot. The following weeks were difficult in the way that quiet things are difficult. No shouting, no dramatic confrontations. Just the daily weight of a relationship that had been changed and couldn't quite yet find its new shape. Nadine called 3 times during January. The first call was tense. The second was tearful. The third was something closer to honest. She told me she hadn't fully realized how far things had drifted. She said Scott had been so certain about his plans that she had let his certainty become hers. She said she was sorry. I believed her. That was the complicated part. I believed she was genuinely sorry, and I also knew that belief didn't immediately repair what had eroded. "I know you're sorry," I told her. "I'm going to need some time." "How much time?" "I don't know," I said honestly. Scott reached out once by email, a carefully worded message that was clearly drafted with some help. He acknowledged that he had overstepped. He outlined what he believed he had contributed and expressed hope for a resolution that was fair to both sides. It was professional in tone and almost entirely absent of anything personal. I read it twice, replied that I had received it, and forwarded it to Francis. The business situation itself resolved more cleanly than the personal one. Francis drew up clear documentation establishing the current ownership structure and a formal employment arrangement for both Nadine and Scott, with explicit terms around compensation, responsibilities, and any future ownership discussion. I had those documents reviewed by a separate attorney just to be thorough. Scott signed. Nadine signed. Neither of them looked happy about it, but neither refused. Spring came slowly to East Tennessee that year. The dogwoods bloomed late, the way they do after a hard winter. I started coming into the office only twice a week instead of 3 times, not because I was retreating, but because I was genuinely beginning to step back in a way that was now structured and intentional rather than assumed. I started doing other things with my time. I joined a woodworking group that met on Saturday mornings at a community workshop near my neighborhood. I took a long weekend to drive up through the Smoky Mountains, something Beverly and I had planned to do for years, and somehow always postponed. I visited Douglas in Chattanooga twice, and the second time I stayed for 4 days and helped him rebuild a porch railing system that had been soft for 2 seasons. Somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary living, I noticed something. I was less tired. I had been tired for a very long time, without recognizing it as the particular exhaustion of a man trying to maintain peace inside a situation that had slowly become dishonest. Without that weight, without the constant low-level labor of pretending not to notice what I was noticing, something in me simply rested. My grandson, Nadine's oldest, turned 13 that spring. He was a sharp, quiet kid who liked mechanical things and asked good questions. We'd always gotten along. When Nadine brought him over one afternoon to help me sort through some old shop equipment I was donating, he and I spent 2 hours going through bins of parts and tools, and he asked me more thoughtful questions about how presses worked than most adults ever had. At one point he looked up at me and said, "Grandpa, is everything okay between you and Mom?" I took my time answering. "We're working through some things," I said. "That happens in families sometimes." He thought about that. Then he said, "She's been different lately." "Different how?" "Like she's sorry about something but doesn't know how to say it." I looked at him for a moment. 13 years old and already better at reading rooms than half the adults I knew. "She'll figure out how to say it," I told him. "She just needs a little more time." He nodded and seemed to accept that. I thought about Beverly on the drive home. I thought about how she would have handled all of it differently. She would have confronted things earlier, moved faster, said harder truths sooner. But she also would have been the first to sit down at a kitchen table with Nadine and find a path through. She was better at the repair than I am. I work better with wood and machines than with fractured relationships. I move slower. I need more time to find the right words. But I was finding them. In August, Nadine asked if I would come to her daughter's birthday dinner. A family thing, nothing large, just the 4 of them, and me and Douglas. I went. The evening was careful, at first, the way things are when people are still learning the new distance between them. Scott was polite in a subdued way. Nadine moved between the kitchen and the dining room, trying to make everything feel normal. The kids were loud and good and entirely unaffected by the grown-up complications around them, which was exactly right. After dinner, Nadine and I ended up on the back porch while Scott helped the kids with dessert inside. The sun was going down over the ridge. The air smelled like the end of summer, that particular mix of grass and heat, and something cooler underneath, Nadine said. I didn't understand what I had until I almost lost it. I looked at her. "Not the business," she said quickly. Then, "Well, the business too, but I meant you." I didn't say anything immediately. She continued, not rushing. "Scott had a vision, and I got swept up in it. I told myself it was for our future, for our kids. But I stopped asking what you wanted. I stopped asking who you were in all of it." She looked at the ridge. "Mom would have been really disappointed in me." I considered that for a moment. "Your mother would have been disappointed for about 10 minutes, I said. "Then she would have started working on fixing it." Nadine half laughed. Her eyes were wet. "That's what we do now," I said. "We start working on fixing it." She nodded. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't a closing argument. It was more like two people agreeing to keep walking in the same directions and see what the path looks like from there. That's how real things repair, in my experience. Not with speeches, not with formal declarations, with a series of small ordinary moments that slowly rebuild what was damaged. The way you repair old wood, carefully, with the right materials, without expecting it to look like it did before. It will look like something else, something that still holds, something that carries the marks of what it's been through. The business is still mine. I'm still figuring out what the right transition looks like, and I'm in no rush to figure it out on anyone else's timeline, but my own. Francis and I have had several good conversations about different structures, and some of them involve Nadine in ways that could still work down the road, if the trust continues to rebuild. Scott and I are not close. Maybe we never will be. There's a kind of man who can apologize professionally, but never quite personally, and I suspect Scott is that kind of man. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because understanding people accurately is part of how you stop being surprised by them. But Nadine is my daughter. That is not a temporary fact. Last October, I drove out to a spot Beverly and I had always loved, a pullout on a ridge road above the valley, where on clear days you can see 50 miles in 3 directions. I went in the late afternoon when the light was going gold across the hills. I sat there for a long time. I thought about the printing shop, about 32 years of work that started as just me and one press in a rented space and grew into something that employed 12 people and outlasted 3 economic downturns. I thought about the LLC I'd set up carefully, the accounts I'd maintained properly, the documentation that had protected everything I'd built when it mattered most. I thought about Beverly, who had always known the difference between what was legally mine and what was genuinely mine. The legally mine part I'd handled. The genuinely mine part was still being worked on. That's how it goes. You do the paperwork, then you do the harder work. And if you're lucky and patient and willing to show up even when it's uncomfortable, the harder work eventually gets done too. I'm still here, still working, still showing up. That's enough for now.